Good evening, everybody. We still have some people joining in. And just to let you all know, we are going live with the recording so that other people who may not have been able to sign up in time will get a chance to view this as well. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. My name is Jasmine Harris, and this is a kickoff for our Decoding Omaha series. Again, I'm running for mayor of Omaha, and the outpour of support and just the well wishes and affirmations that have been coming through have been amazing. And I thank you all, Omaha, for that, because if we want change, we have to make sure that we have people there on the ground who are experiencing the issues that we are having at the table to create that change. We cannot keep having a top-down approach in how we are going to get our city on track and ready for the future. And so what Decoding Omaha is about is looking at different areas of Omaha, topics that affect Omaha, and how do we get into these situations and how do we get ourselves out of it. And what I wanted to do was bring in individuals who are on the front lines daily, working on these issues, who have contact with people who are going through these problems, and ensuring that their voices are heard and that what they are doing, therefore, uh, it gives us a chance to bring in those solutions to the problems that we want to address with the campaign and when I get into office. So today, with the kickoff, we are joined by Dr. Erin Feistinger, and she's going to be talking about housing with us and this housing situation that we find ourselves here in Omaha. Ashley Spivey, who is founder of Ivy Black Girl, was supposed to be with us tonight, but she had a family emergency, and we want to send all prayers and positive thoughts to her and her family at this time. And so hopefully we can get her on at a later time to talk about racial equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how that impacts policy here in Omaha and how we can move forward with that. So again, thank you all for joining us. And I'm gonna kick it off with Dr. Erin Feistinger. I met Erin through the Women's Fund of Omaha Circles leadership group. And we went through this policy intensive where it's about getting more women into the policy landscape and how women's voices really matter when it comes to talking about reproduction rights, the gap, the wage gap, inequality, and just really getting women involved in how do we create change at a policy level. And when I saw Erin talking, I was like, she knows it. She was so feisty about it and just led with passion when it came to really digging into how women can impact change at a policy level. And we've been friends ever since. And I thank you for joining us this evening. Now, we both work for nonprofits, and because I am running for office, we can't bring that up. But the expertise that Erin has in working in the housing and preventing homelessness here in Omaha is extensive. In her work around policy, you must follow her on Twitter because she is down at City Council all the time and letting us know everything that's going on down there. So thank you, Erin, for joining us. And I just want to start this conversation off with, how did Omaha get into the housing situation that it's in? I say it's a crisis. And I know it's across the nation, but if you can speak specifically to how Omaha is finding itself in this situation, I really want people to hear that, because what this is about is getting people to see maybe they don't necessarily know how things happen. They don't have all the information or have never even heard that there was a housing problem. I don't know. But to just really educate and dig into what that problem is.
Yeah, that's an easy question right off the bat. That's a joke, everyone. Zoom is not my platform. I can't wait to get out from under this. But, first off, thanks, Jasmine, for having me. When Ashley dropped out, I was like, that's terrible, because she's amazing and her organization is amazing and everything that she does is amazing. then I was like, oh wait, I used to like lecture professionally, so I can do this for an hour. It's fine, to everyone's chagrin. So the housing crisis in Omaha. Before everyone jumped on, I was joking with Jasmine. I said, what crisis? Because it feels like a lot of people don't treat it as such. And the reason that a lot of people, I think, don't see a housing crisis is one, the beauty of willful ignorance. And then two, the way that our city is built and the way that it's grown allows people, I think, to not to ignore what's going on, and then also to keep a literal distance between themselves and what is happening in communities all across Omaha. So I think that the biggest thing to talk about first off is that our current housing patterns in Omaha are racist, and they were based in intentionally discriminating against communities of color. And I see a lot of people on this call who already know, that this is redlining and what that means. But for people who don't, this was an intentional policy in the, oh my gosh, someone jump in and tell me exactly when this was. I want to say the 30s. But it's also 7 p.m. and I have a 9-month-old who I can hear causing trouble downstairs. So redlining was an intentional policy by real estate and city officials and to sort of mark off specific neighborhoods and literally label them desirable, declining, and dangerous. And they call it redlining because the communities that were redlined, that were deemed dangerous or declining, were colored in red. I will give everyone on this call a couple guesses, actually only one guess, about where these communities were in Omaha. Thank you, Liz, in the chat. Racist policies in the 1930s, redlining in the 40s. Appreciate it very much. So these areas are in North Omaha and South Omaha. These were intentional policies. They were created and propped up by local government, by state government, and even by the federal government. So these were intended to keep specific communities contained and to make sure that the desirable populations lived elsewhere and lived separate. This led to disinvestment in those communities compared to the mountains of investment that we've dumped into more desirable neighborhoods as the city grew west. And there are other intentional policies that we've used since redlining to facilitate that growth and that separation. SIDs, or sanitary improvement districts, annexation, what Palma Strand over at Creighton has called the SID plus annexation regime. And this has meant that the city typically supports West Omaha, and I grew up in West Omaha, so I can say this, but they support like West Omaha and the type of housing development that we see in West Omaha. So those large single family lots, wide streets, those kinds of things. And all of our resources have gone to that type of development and have gone to that specific geographic distribution of housing and of opportunity as our city grows west. Our schools have gone there, our population has gone there, all to the detriment of the urban core. And then we've just kind of assumed that in my mind, I think that we assume that if we just kind of ignore that our housing patterns continue to be discriminatory and continue to be to perpetuate racism and to perpetuate economic inequality and wealth disparity and unequal access to opportunity and unequal access to education and all of these things. If we just ignore it, then it means that we're not being discriminatory anymore. And I think that that's wrong. I should say that with more force. It is wrong. We can't just ignore it. So I think that the crisis that we're seeing now is very interesting, not just because of this historic move to contain communities in specific places and then to move west, to move all of our wealth and all of our investment west in Omaha. But we're also seeing this trend now, I think, where we're seeing a renewed interest in the urban core, and we're seeing that it's more desirable to move back. And in a way, this is really good because I'm a huge fan of urban density. I think that we should build up, not out, and get as many people back into the urban core as possible. But we're doing it in a way that is still making the crisis worse, and still it's not addressing the need for safe, affordable housing in our community. So we're like buying up affordable housing. And I see Christian's on here, so he knows well what this looks like. People are buying up this affordable housing, they're flipping it, and they're making it unattainable to the people who live in the neighborhood. They're buying up 2 flats, old rooming houses, etc., converting them to single family housing. And we've done all of this under the auspices, right, of like revitalization, like revitalizing these neighborhoods. And Jasmine, you and I don't live that far away from each other, so we see this happening in our neighborhood all the time. So revitalization in Omaha has really meant displacement right now. And I think that that is something that we can change if we are as intentional about creating housing equity and addressing this type of discriminatory housing. If we are as intentional about that as we were when we created the policies that made this mess in the first place, we can't ignore it. We can't just like assume that, developers are going to do the right thing, or, that it'll just kind of trickle down. I don't know how they think it's going to work, but we need to be really intentional about how to address this issue of a lack of affordability in our neighborhoods, and a lack of access to housing for people who need it. I mean, like at the basis, and I could go on forever, so I'm going to stop after this, but like, let's just start this conversation and every conversation with the assumption that housing is a human right and that every single person needs access to safe, affordable housing if we're going to ask them to do anything else in their lives. And like, let's start there and then move on. Like then we can work together on things, I think.
Most definitely. I think also when we're looking at it, and you threw out the term safe and affordable housing. And I think most people don't put those two together, because, well, we need affordable housing, but we also need safe housing. And can you dig into a little bit more about the definitions of what affordable housing is, one, because sometimes it's just this word that people throw out and no one can say, well, what is affordable housing? And then when we're talking about safe housing, what does that mean?
Right. So affordable housing, people don't have there's lots of definitions for what affordable means. I usually operate when I'm talking to policymakers on the HUD definition, right? Like you are considered rent burden. You are considered, kind of in danger if you are paying more than 30% of your income to your housing. So that's kind of like the baseline. And it's astonishing how many people are living rent burdened, and then how many people are extremely rent burdened on top of that. Like, I was just thinking about this morning, how much of my life I spent paying 70% of my income to housing. And Laura, yes, that is rent, and that should be housing and utility. Laura asked a question in the chat, does that include rent and utilities? And to me, it does include rent and utilities, because if you don't have your utilities, then you are considered homeless by HUD standards as well, because you're living in a place that is unfit for human habitation. So everything to maintain your housing should be about 30%. And that actually brings up a really good point too, because I think so much of what housing is, when we talk about it as if it's like it is certainly part of a market. It is certainly part of the economy, all of that. But really, right, like it's home and all of the emotions that that means. And so there is the 30% affordability, sort of baseline. But I think it's also really important to recognize that even 30% may be out of reach for some people. And we don't understand the nuances of everybody's lives or what they're bringing into the situation, right? So we also need to be really cognizant, I think, of, and this is hard to explain in a policy sense, but we also, just as people living in these communities and as future policymakers, being aware that people might not feel that they can afford or that they can afford to keep a roof over their heads. And I think really being aware of what that means in a person's life and how that reverberates throughout the rest of their life. So in terms of affordable, yes, I mean, right, like the baseline is 30% of your income should be spent toward, or, that's how much you should be spending towards your housing. And that's what they use to sort of sort out public housing and that kind of those assistance programs. In terms of safe housing, there's a lot of meanings to that as well. For me, when I usually talk about safe housing, it's feeling safe and stable and secure in your home. And a lot of times that means code enforcement, which is probably, I think before I got into housing, I don't know that I ever once thought about code enforcement ever in my entire life. I'm also incredibly privileged, but it just seems really boring or whatever. But if you think about what you would feel like if your door doesn't lock, or if your window's broken in the middle of winter and your landlord won't fix it, and what that means for how you feel about yourself and how you feel about your stability, and makes it difficult to go to work, it makes it difficult to find a job, like all of these things. I think the best example of this was when we were trying to get the rental ordinance passed in a long time ago, 2019, I want to say. We took city council members on a tour of a couple apartment units up the street from me, up here on 52nd and Northwest Radial. Maybe you've seen them, red brick, right there on the corner across from Benson High School.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, we could take them now. I know that there are some city council members going around 48 Sailor, Taylor, and Boyd. So you know what I'm talking about there too. So we took them on those, on a tour of some of those units. And I remember that I tell the story all the time, so sorry for everyone who's heard it, but we walked into one apartment and there was like a 5-year-old girl there, and she was wearing a princess crown and like just living her life, and right, like she was just thrilled to see us. She was like, let me tell you everything that I saw today, and like, I'm going to show you all of the special things in my house, like all of this. And then like, she shows us like her bedroom, and there's mouse holes in the wall in the baseboard, and her favorite Moana blanket is covered in bed bugs, and there's cockroaches and all of this. Like, she's missed school because of bed bugs, and her brother's missed school because of asthma, because of mold in the apartment. Like, her parents have had to miss work because of losing sleep trying to keep the bed bugs out of their kids' rooms. Like all of these things, when you are unsafe in your housing, that can impact the rest of your life. And like, that's what I think about with safe housing. Like, when I come home, I feel like, I mean, granted, I haven't left my house in 9 months now, but before COVID, when I used to leave my house, right, like I would come home and I would feel like safe, and this is where I live, and this is my space, and like everything's going to be relatively okay. Like, maybe my sink doesn't drain as much as it should. That's a whole other problem. But right, like generally I feel like I can lay my head down and feel really fine about life. And if you don't feel safe in your housing because of all these other reasons, like you can't have that moment at the end of the day. And that matters. It's more than a market. It's more than an economy. It's more than whatever. It's your home. So I could keep talking. I'm just gonna end all of my comments with I could keep
I
talking.
can keep talking. Yeah, and that just shows how much goes into this. When we're talking about we need people to have safe and affordable housing. One of the things that you touched on was it being a right to have safe and affordable housing. And me and the public health background, we talk about the social determinants of health. And I like to throw in there Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If someone doesn't have their basic needs met, how do you expect them to get to the next level to focus on things like being civically involved in elections, things like that? So I think we really have to dig into what you said there, this being a basic right. And how do we get to that process or get to that level of where people can feel safe and secure in their homes and then afford it? Because I think when we talk about it, it's just, oh, that's housing. But like you said, when you're spending more than 30% of your income on your housing, then you're burdened.
Mm-hmm.
And that ties into whether someone is employed and underemployed. So there is just not its own little thing in its own little box. It's so much intersectionality that goes into that. I've seen that there was a question in the chat box about the inspection process of rentals. And I kind of want to start moving into that realm. How do we dig our way out of our housing issue when we're talking about elected officials and policy? And I'd also like to know, what were the reactions of the city council members when you took them to the apartments?
Yeah. All right, let's start unpacking all this. Okay, great. One thing I want to point out, I think right as everyone was entering the room, I put a link up at the top of the chat. And Jasmine, you can share this out to whoever, but it's a link to the City of Omaha's affirmatively furthering fair housing study. And what that was under the Obama administration, he was looking at our fair housing policies and saying, like, we can't just be reacting in the defensive to, like, discrimination and that kind of stuff. We can't just be responding to past discrimination. We need to be proactively addressing it. And so HUD came out with a rule that every, city needed to have an AFFH plan, which basically lays out all of the issues around housing that currently exist, has some background about how we got there, and then lays out solutions. So this exists in the city of Omaha. They write it, we have it, and it's actually an incredibly comprehensive and insightful document. And I shouldn't say actually, because the people who write it are really wonderful and smart and trying to do the right thing. So that I linked to that, and I would just encourage you to take a look at it and just peruse through it, because it's got a lot of really excellent data and solutions, and it exists. I've had to tell some elected officials that it exists, which disturbs me, but that's all right. Getting back to your original question, I think to get out of this, we need to truly address what it means, what this discrimination has meant, what are intentional policies that have not only, perpetuated racism, but have increased income inequality and wealth disparity and all of the inequity that comes from that through our housing policy, whether we intentionally did it back in the day or whether we've just ignored that it has an impact now. And so we need to really confront what that looks like and what it means, because again, it's not just housing. If you look at the original redlining map and you overlay it with all these other maps that currently exist, if we go to safe housing, the neighborhoods with the most code violations and the code violations that take the longest to get resolved, those maps are virtually indistinguishable, with the exception of Northwest Omaha around 108th and Fort, which is becoming a real hotspot now as well. Or you look at the current map of non-majority white census tracts, or the current map of what HUD defines as racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, or the map of areas that Omaha has deemed blighted, evictions, the lowest performing schools, and now the most cases of COVID. If you look at all of those maps, they are the same. Like they are almost identical. And I think that we need to confront what that means and to really take stock of that, because we talk about housing in all these other areas and we don't talk about it as like literally the where it all starts, like the foundation. I mean, we do talk about it, but it's usually like people making judgments against poor people and their morals, right? They'll be like, it all starts at home, you know? And it's like, let's flip that on its head and like actually start from there. Like, it all does start at home. So let's act like it. And I think that there's this fundamental problem with real estate generally, that like one of the most foundational pieces in a person's life, a home, is also fundamentally understood as a profit-making machine, right? Like investment properties and that kind of thing. And so you end up in this like Orwellian situation during COVID where you actually have people making the argument that we can't temporarily pause evictions for non-payment and stop people from becoming homeless in the midst of an unprecedented public health and economic crisis because people need to pay the mortgage on their investment properties, as if these are like in any way comparable. So I think we need to like be really intentional about the way we're confronting our past about housing, and really intentional about the way we talk about housing. And now I'm going to actually get to your question. What can we do? I have some ideas. One, I think we need to immediately stop annexing parts of West Omaha. We need to invest heavily in affordable housing. And I don't just mean passing through dollars, which is what's happening now. It's not that the city is setting aside money for like affordable housing. What they're doing is they're getting money and distributing it. So that's like your CDBG, which is your community development block grants, or your ESG money, which is emergency solutions grants, all very, very valuable tools that we have, but it's not like what we need is like a devoted fund where a percentage of some monies from something, and I don't know the best idea for this, right? But I don't know, like say you have a cigarette tax or something, and like $1 goes to an affordable housing fund, something like that. Don't do that actually, because that's just criminalizing the poor even more. But some monies go to an affordable housing fund that would support the development of low-income housing, because it is not profitable to develop low-income housing, and that's why it doesn't get developed. And it's not easy either. I also mean, like when I talk about investing heavily in affordable housing, I also mean helping people maintain their homes so they don't get pushed out of their neighborhoods, helping them address their code violations, right? Like people who are living in their houses and they're just kind of falling apart because they're old houses. Like, let's help them maintain that house so they can stay in it and not have to sell it to an investor. I get probably, living in North Benson, I think I get like 3 calls a day for people trying to buy my house for cash. Like, let's keep people in their homes if we can. I mean, we fully fund and staff the housing and community development arm of the planning department and give them the flexibility and the freedom that they need to actually exercise their mission and enact the policy solutions that are in the affirmatively furthering fair housing study that they produce. I mean, taking control of TIF, tax increment financing, and mandating that a percentage of units in every residential project be set aside for low income neighbors, because that money is supposed to be used to help redevelop neighborhoods like Benson, which are apparently blighted, right? But what we do is we use TIF as a tool to build luxury studios, and then we push out the people who live here. I've got all sorts of data on TIF. But that's actually a conversation that's going to start happening pretty soon. So watch City Council closely, or I guess follow my Twitter if you don't want to actually sit through City Council like I do. I have more ideas. Sorry, code enforcement. We have to be more proactive. We have to have more code enforcement. We have to have more inspectors, and we need to have a city council and a mayor and an entire infrastructure set up to support them in their mission. And we need to decrease evictions. This will decrease poverty. It'll help it'll help us to confront our past of racial discrimination. And honestly, we just need to be aware of this issue. I wrote a bunch of, I have notes up on here, and there's a bunch of curse words on the notes under that, but I'll leave that out. But like, I think that there's some really basic things that we can do to just be aware of the issue. One that seems somewhat unrelated, but that really bothers me. And if anyone on this call is also running for city council or anything, please do that. Please repeal the panhandling ordinance. Like, just repeal it, because what that is saying to anybody who is struggling or like finding themselves in that situation is that we don't want to see you, right? And like, if we can just like confront that idea and just like not be a-holes about this, and actually putting being an a-hole into an ordinance is just like insane to me. So just repeal it. It's not going to bother anyone, and it's bullshit anyway. And the other thing I think that needs to happen for anybody who's in leadership at the city, or who's in leadership anywhere, honestly, is elevate the voices of the people who are experiencing housing instability, who are on the front lines, like doing this work, the case managers who are dealing every day with the absolute crushing and overwhelming despair of our community right now. Elevate those people's voices, not the voices of people who profit from this madness. Like, that's what needs to happen, and that's what's missing in this conversation first and foremost. I mean, aside from the part that we're not even at a point in the community where we can all agree that housing is a human right, like that piece as well really needs to happen. And like, I don't know, I'm not the person to do it, so like, everyone else take that away from me. Sorry, I'm going to end because I won't stop.
And I think that's very critical. Like I said, I'm a firm believer in the solutions are going to come from people who are experiencing those problems. It's not going to come from a top-down approach, because that's why we're still where we are. Like you said, we have the TIF dollars going to these luxury apartments while we still have people struggling to get 4 walls and a roof over their head.
Mm-hmm. Or to keep them from falling in on them, right? We have people literally trying to do that.
That too. I think you also kind of talked about some of that policy that needs to happen. And one of those things that came about recently after the Yale Park apartment situation was this landlord rental registry. Can you give some insight to that? How is it working right now? And what needs to happen to ensure that it's working?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So I feel like my professional life is just like moving from frustration to frustration, banging my head against wall after wall. And the rental ordinance was a lot like that. So just for people who don't know, before we passed this rental ordinance, we had in Omaha a complaint-based code system. So what that meant was that code enforcement could only act on a code violation, or could only cite a code violation if they had received a direct complaint about it. So let's say you're driving around a code, an inspector's driving around and clearly sees, a code violation problem or something. They couldn't stop unless someone had called in that code. Now think about what that means if you are a person who is a returning citizen and this is the only place that you could get. If you have an eviction on your record, if you are a single mom with kids, if you don't have anywhere else to go, are you going to call in a complaint on your landlord who's giving you this housing? Probably not. Like, imagine, this is how we got to Yale Park, was imagine you're a refugee who doesn't know how to navigate this system. Like, and that's how you get what happened at Yale Park. So we had this system. So what we wanted was a proactive code inspection system, and we wanted a rental registration as well, so that we had a sense of where, first off, we have no idea how many rental units are actually in Omaha. So that's just useful to know. And then also to know, we wanted to know the contact information for people who are managing these properties so that we knew who to call if we did have a problem. So the rental ordinance looks like we have a rental registration piece first, which everyone was supposed to be registered by 90 days after implementation. So I think you had till the end of March to do that, to register all of your rental properties. And the second part of that is a proactive inspection system that has two pieces. One is a 10-year cycle. So if you are a good landlord, and I shouldn't say like good landlord, but if you are a landlord who does not have code violation or unresolved code violations, then you're on this 10-year cycle where code will show up once every 10 years and inspect all your units. And if you pass, then it's fine and you can go on with your life. The other part is an annual inspection cycle, and this is for property managers who have not resolved code violations in the last 3 years or who do not register their properties. And that you will be inspected once every year for 2 years. And if you pass those 2 inspections, you can get off. I could talk about that forever. But anyway, so that got off the ground 2 weeks, after COVID hit. So it seems to me that it's not working great right now. And part of the reason for that is that we kneecapped it right from the beginning by not staffing the housing inspection team with enough inspectors to do this work. And then second, we have no real enforcement mechanism to figure out who has registered and who has not. So I don't know if there's any landlords listening, but I will tell you that me and my team have been working diligently on this to find everyone who is not registered. So for instance, we've taken all the eviction addresses from March to August and ran them through the rental registration database to figure out if they were registered. And what we found was that 39% of the evictions that happened in Omaha, in Douglas County, were from addresses that had not been registered on the rental registration. So if you're living in a rental unit, I'm happy to walk you through checking if your rental unit is registered to figure this out. But yeah, I hope that in a year or two, or hopefully in a year, we can revisit the ordinance and really, we have a lot of ideas about how to strengthen it because it's not going to do the work that it needs to do, but it is much better than what we had. And that's something. So, I mean, we started from 0. Now we have something. So that's good.
Yeah. And I think that's what needs to happen. There's policies that come along, but at the end of the day, they're kind of just like compromises that we're going to do something. It may not be what you want us to do, but it's going to do something. And I think that right there, when you're saying an organization on its own, taking its time and effort to dig through and find information on these rentals, and 39% that you have found of those evictions, that's, I mean, it may not be majority, but that's still a whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's also like, it's connected, I think, too, to earlier. I mean, my big issue right now is evictions and just trying to stop people from getting evicted under COVID. But yeah, I mean, I think it goes to the issue of safe, affordable housing. We have vulnerable people who are living in units that, can't even be bothered to fill out an online form, because it doesn't cost anything to register. It's nothing to do it. You just didn't want to, I guess. I could say a lot of things that'll probably get me in trouble later, so I'll just stop.
But then I also think it's telling when you're saying we don't even know how many rental units are in the city.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that in there and of itself is its own problem. How are you going to track someone or track something and you have no baseline for tracking?
Yeah.
So
and that's really, I think that ends up becoming a real problem too, just in terms of how, what kind of solutions we have to address this incredible shortage of housing, affordable, accessible housing in our community. Is it we don't even we don't have a baseline to understand, what the availability even really is. And so there are studies that are taking place, that are all going to be made public probably next year, that are showing that it's gonna, if we continue down our current path in Omaha, it's going to cost us billions of dollars to try to make up the difference, of how of like the units that we need to keep people safe and stable versus how many we have. I mean, right now I think it's 1 to 100. Like, we have 1 unit for every 100 people who actually need a space. And that's only going to get worse unless we throw a wrench in the wheel right now and just stop the whole thing and figure out what's going on and build back. I'm going to use is that a Joe Biden thing? Build back better. Is that why that's in my head?
It
oh
is.
my God, this all needs to be over.
And I'll ask one last thing, and then we'll get into a couple of questions that have come through on the chat. When we're talking about some of those solutions out there, and I haven't talked to you about this or anyone else, what is the feeling for rental caps?
Please. I mean, I'm all for, again, I'm going to say some things that'll probably get me in trouble, but I think a rent cap is a good idea. And that's just the population of people that I serve and work with, that would be really helpful. And I also think there's a lot of things that the city could do to just intervene and you have the power to step in and change the trajectory. I think a rent cap is one thing. I think setting up a local ordinance that that landlords are not allowed to discriminate based on source of income. That's something we can do at the local level that would, help people who are receiving any other type of assistance to be able to access housing. I've got all sorts of ideas. I love that, Jasmine. Let's do it.
I'm just throwing it out there as digging into housing and what's being done and what's being brought up. I think that was one of the thoughts that was on there. I'm gonna go. There's a question that came through on Facebook. And so, what pathways have other places taken when addressing housing shortages? So other areas that are addressing their issues, that are actually showing progress, what are they doing?
Yeah, so I think right now, in terms of just the straight market for affordable housing, I think that Minneapolis has been somewhat the gold standard here recently. One thing that they did was they got rid of single family zoning, which sounds kind of boring, but what it does is open up the possibility for density, which equals affordability. So right now it is much easier to downzone than it is to upzone. So if I wanted to turn my single family home into a 2-flat or a 3-flat, it would be very difficult for me to do that. But if I had purchased it as a 3-flat and wanted to turn it into a single family home, thereby getting rid of possibly 2 affordable units, it would be much easier for me to do that. Does that make sense? I think that makes sense.
Yeah, totally get it. So you are rewarded, or it's easier for you to take away housing options for people.
Yes, that's exactly the way to put it. You are rewarded for taking away housing. And it would also open up things like having accessory dwelling units. My garage is currently falling over, so I would not turn it into an accessory dwelling unit. But if I wanted to, that would be, I would be able to do that, or set up a tiny home in my backyard or something like that, that would increase the availability of housing. There are also examples of cities who are taking part of their property tax and devoting it specifically to an affordable housing fund to support the development of affordable housing. The neighborhood I used to live in Chicago had the TIF percentage to 30% of any residential unit getting TIF in our neighborhood had to be affordable. Like, there are all of these ways that we can take the existing infrastructure, the existing tools that we do have, and just leverage them to make more housing. But we also just need to, at the very basis, we need to decide that we're going to do this. Like, we need to decide that our investment is going into affordable housing, that we're going to help our neighbors. And we are not there as a city. We are not anywhere close to that in my experience right now. And if we just had a few leaders who would step up and say, listen, this is a priority and we're going to have to figure out how to do it, then we're all going to suffer through a couple years, right, of like fighting with each other over what this means. But at the end of it will be a much more equitable community if we have housing justice and if we decide to act on it than our current state, which is just screaming into the void as far as I can tell. So,
and then that's what it seems like. People are screaming that I need help with housing. We have no housing, and there's no answers. Another question that came through: 100% understand that rentals that are not up to code are on the owners. However, if homes are so far blighted and rents have not been increased, how are owners to update all properties while not expecting to increase rents?
Yeah, I saw this question come through, and it's a constant problem. I see Christian Gray's on here. We talk about this sometimes. We've had this conversation. I sympathize with this problem. I think, there are a lot of small mom and pop landlords who have one rental property, and it's more expensive every day to do anything. So I get it. And I'm honestly not talking about the people who haven't replaced the bathroom fan or like have, the gutters dented or, the kind of everyday wear and tear code violations that happen. I'm talking about the landlords that the roof is falling in and they're not doing anything about it. There's a gas leak. There's raw sewage in the basement. Like, I mean, these are things that are happening in our neighborhoods and that people are living with, right? Like, that I talked to one woman where she was taking a shower. She'd been complaining to her landlord that the ceiling was leaking, hadn't done a thing. Her son was taking a shower and the ceiling collapsed in on him. Like, I mean, that's what I'm talking about. So I think that we do need to invest money into affordable housing, into all the different aspects. And so this specific problem that you're talking about, where, maybe it's not entirely up to code, the city does have a fund and we should use it more and increase it to help landlords deal with these sort of small issues and get their units up to code. But there are landlords and there are property managers in our community whose entire business model is based off buying these properties and not taking care of them and charging more rent than because they can. Like, and that's the problem that I'm worried about. It's not, my aunt and uncle who just haven't made it over to do some work on something, right? So I think that's the problem we need to focus on first, and then we can support everything else. So hopefully I'm not alienating too many people with that, but I just don't want children living in houses with basements full of raw sewage. That's really my main thing.
Totally get it. And that makes me go into thinking, if you can't afford to run the business, which they're looking at it as, then you need to get out of the business.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. That's like, if this is a business to you, like, and you're not doing it well, then get out. I don't know. Like, if you can't we don't let restaurants continue to operate if they've made like all of their people sick. Why are we letting this happen? If this is where people live, this is where children go to sleep. Like, yeah, anyway.
You got to take it from that standpoint. That's exactly what it is. Another question that came through, I'm interested in what the best metrics are for us to track our progress. What are the key indicators we are or should be tracking?
Of course, this came from Craig. I see you, Craig. Um, yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I think that the typical metrics we use to assess housing have been focused on homelessness. So we count shelters, we count shelter beds and that kind of thing. And I think that that is valuable. But I also think that there are layers that we're missing when we only focus on homelessness, and we need to be thinking more about housing and stability. And homelessness is part of that. So there are metrics to figure out how many people are rent burdened in a community. The American Community Survey does this really well. And if you look at the AFFH, they have good metrics in terms of like access to employment centers and that kind of thing. So there are sort of more holistic ways to look at housing that are more than just homelessness. And I think that that's what we need to be thinking about. We need to be figuring out how many people are in need. And honestly, we have so much data right now from COVID to be able to figure this out. Like if you just go back through the county board meetings and look through, and this is just, my fun hobby. But I also post about it a lot. We have weekly zip code breakdowns of where rental assistance requests are coming from and how many are coming from each zip code. So we have data that shows where people are struggling and how many people are struggling. And I think once we get to the other side of this, of COVID, if we ever do, we get to the other side of it, we're going to be able to look back on it and see how many people were living on the margins that we didn't even think about beforehand, because that's what we're seeing now. So I think, Craig, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I hope a city can have in a really concerted and intentional way, which we're not doing right now. Like we're just not doing it. So as a city, as a community, there are certainly pockets that are doing it. There's even pockets in the city that are doing it, but just not in a sort of collaborative way that would actually help us get somewhere else and get somewhere better. So, but we'll talk more.
I want to thank you so much. Oh, Craig, will the study you reference answer it at all?
Yeah, some of it. I'll send it to you. And Christian, we can talk about codes. I think that you're right to a certain extent about needing to reevaluate our codes. And that's something when we talk about the rental ordinance later, that's what we're hoping to revisit, is figure out if we can fine tune the ordinance in a way that that does let those sort of like, oh, the bathroom fan is too noisy, that kind of code violation isn't as important as the one, right, that there's a gas leak or like there's standing water in this room. Like I understand that those things are different. So that's something to do, but let's get to a part where we all need access to safe and affordable housing, and then we'll work on that. Jasmine, I interrupted you. Sorry.
No, you're fine. I didn't see that question from Christian come through. We're down on our time, but I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight and giving us the rundown on housing in Omaha. That is one of the things that as mayor, I want to address, is making sure that housing for our people are considered human rights, and that we are really working to ensure that people have a roof over their head, 4 walls, and that it's safe and affordable, because we expect people to go to work and be productive community members, and still they can't, because they have to worry about, where am I going to lay my head?
Yeah. And let me give a plug to Jasmine real quick. Like Jasmine knows this issue intimately because of your work with returning citizens. And you know how difficult it is to find housing and to try to be a productive citizen that you've been told to be, right? If you have a record, if you have, we've set up all of these unnecessary and arbitrary barriers for people to find safe, affordable housing. And it's incredibly important that we have people with that kind of experience and insight, helping to lead that conversation. So I had to plug you because you didn't sound like you were about to.
No, I'm not, I don't plug my work like that, but that, thank you, because um that's why I'm running for mayor, because I have that standpoint where I'm in the trenches doing work in and day out, working with community members on the issues that we really need to solve. And that is an extension of my work and why I'm running for mayor, because I am on the front lines and I am there with people and I'm hearing these problems and I'm hearing the solutions and no one else is getting it. And we need someone in City Hall who is going to get it, who understands what people are going through. So again, I thank you, Aaron, for joining us tonight. As always, very insightful. So please continue to keep up the good fight for us. We're going to need it. And anyone who is on this call or watching live, come out Saturday. This Saturday from 1 to 3, we'll be down towards Fontenelle Park's Pavilion. I need 1,000 signatures to make it onto the ballot. So this is a quick drive up, sign, and stay safe with your mask on. No hard work on your part, but I need 1,000 signatures to make it onto the ballot. So with that, I thank you all for joining us. And if housing is something that is really on your heart to try and solve, I implore you to get involved. Erin, how can people reach you?
Oh, that's a good question. You can probably just reach me on Twitter first and foremost. Yeah, I'll put my personal email in the chat and just go from there. All I do is answer emails all day.
And what's your Twitter handle?
Oh yeah, that too. There you go.
Erin M. Feistinger at gmail.com. Follow her on Twitter at EMFundertaker. FUNDER. And someone said the address in the park, Fontenelle Park off of 45th and Ames Avenue, 1 to 3 this Saturday. So again, I thank you all. We're at our time, and I ask you all to have a safe evening. Stay healthy.
Thanks, Jasmine.
You're welcome. See you all soon.
Bye.